multiplying and dividing integers. We're going to multiply and divide integers using algebra tiles. Now, when I think about positive 2 multiplied by negative 3, that means two groups of negative 3. So when I do that, I've got one group of negative 3, another group of negative 3, because remember, each tile represents negative 1, and I've got a total of negative 6. So positive multiplied by negative gave me a negative. When I have negative 3 times positive 4, well, how does that work? I can't have negative 3 groups of positive 4. But if I think about 3 times 4, that's the same thing as 4 times 3. The answer doesn't change. So I can rewrite this as positive 4 times negative 3, which means, it's not 3, it means 4 groups of negative 3. So 1, 2, 3, 4 groups of negative 3, and the answer is negative 12. So a negative multiplied by a positive is a negative. So to summarize that, two numbers with opposite signs, when they're multiplied, and we're going to add in or divided, the answer is negative. So if I think about negative 2 multiplied by positive 3, or positive 2 multiplied by negative 3, we just multiply the digits, so 2 times 3 is 6, and both of them will be negative because we had two integers with opposite signs. Now with division, we can change it up a bit and think about, let's look at part D here instead first. I'm taking negative 6 and splitting it up into two groups. That means negative 6 split into two groups. Well, that means I'm going to put 3 negatives in each group. So again, negative divided by a positive is a negative. And similarly, a positive divided by a negative will be a negative. In general, whenever we have two digits with opposite signs, either multiplied or divided, we will always have a negative result. Now, if I look carefully at the chart, I see I've got a positive times a negative, a positive times a negative, a positive times a negative, and then I go to a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative, and a negative times a negative. What's the result going to be? Well, let's use our tiles. 3 times negative 2 means 3 groups of negative 2. So I'm going to put 1, 2, oops, I don't know what happened there. I don't like how this is working. Worked before. All right, well, let's try something different here. We're going to draw our tiles in because that's not working. So we've got 3 groups of negative 2. So 1 group, 2 groups, 3 groups. They're all negative. The answer is negative 6. 2 groups of negative 2. There's 1 group, 2 groups. Well, that's negative 4. 1 group of negative 2. Well, that one's easy. Negative 2. No groups of negative 2. Well, if I don't have any groups, I can't draw anything. So the answer is 0. How do I do negative 1 groups of negative 2? That doesn't make sense. I need to look for a pattern. So let's have a look here and see what's happening. I'm looking at the number of groups, and the number of groups decreases by 1 every time. But my answer, or my result, is actually increasing by 2 every time. So I can put, if I increase by 2, 0 plus 2 is 2, and 2 plus 2 is 4, and 4 plus 2 is 6. So wait a minute, when I multiplied a negative with a negative, I ended up with a positive. So the generalization is if two numbers with the same sign are multiplied or divided, the answer will be positive. Negative 2 times negative 3, two negative signs, The product is positive. 2 times 3 is 6. And a positive times a positive. Well, that makes sense to us because we've been doing that since grade 3 or 4. Positive 6 divided by positive 3. Again, that's grade 3 or 4 math. Don't change it. Don't make it new. The answer is going to be positive. The new part is the negative 6 divided by negative 3, and we just discovered two numbers, same sign being divided. The answer is going to be positive. So in general, two integers with the same sign multiplied or divided will always result in a positive. So let's do a couple examples. Negative 3 multiplied by negative 5. It's a negative and a negative being multiplied. Two integers, same sign. The result will be positive 15. 40 divided by negative 8. Well, 40 doesn't have a sign on it, does it? But when we don't see a sign, it's that number we've been using all the time since grade 1, and we know that really means a positive. A positive divided by a negative, opposite signs for two numbers, the result will be negative, and 40 divided by 8 is 5. Negative 1 to the exponent 3. Well, now we need to remember what negative 1 to the exponent 3. What does an exponent tell me? Oh, right. It tells me how many times I'm multiplying a number by itself. So this really means negative 1 multiplied by negative 1 multiplied by negative 1. Well, the first two are a negative multiplied by a negative, which is a positive. And I just write the other negative down. And a positive 1 times negative 1. Oh, yeah, positive multiplied by negative. It's negative. A negative 2 times negative 7. Again, it's a negative multiplied by a negative, which is a positive. Part E, 0 divided by negative 4. Well, if I have nothing and I share it with 15 people, I still have nothing. So at the end of the day, it doesn't matter whether I divide it by a positive or a negative. If I have nothing, it doesn't matter what I divide it by, I still have nothing. 12 divided by negative 6. Again, 12 is a positive number. And a positive divided by a negative is a negative. Negative 2 multiplied by positive 9 divided by negative 3. Well, that's a fraction, isn't it? It kind of more or less looks like a fraction. There's a numerator, there's a denominator, so everything up top has to be evaluated first. Negative times a positive, so negative 2 times positive 9 gives me a negative. So I've got negative 18 divided by negative 3. And a negative divided by a negative is always a positive.